Forest dragons tend to be fearsome creatures, about twice the size of the average wildcat, short wings that allow them to glide for just enough distance to get in position to kill you, green scales that blend into the surrounding foliage perfectly, razor-sharp claws, and a long snout that could blast intensely hot streams of fire. The fire's speed and heat could be considered to be a bit of a blessing, for it meant nothing was ever ignited, and thus nothing could spread. But anyone who thought that could be tasked with explaining it to the poor soul whose body was reduced to a black crisp. Still, when all was said and done, surviving them was just a matter of knowing what one was doing. Dracomancers often sent teenagers to hunt the ones that became a problem. Mountain dragons, on the other hand, were creatures that no sane man would fight if dragon flame weren't necessary to unlock the full powers of the devoured god's gift. Nefkin and Vorf stared at one of the latter, barely feeling the leftover breeze from its massive wings as it flew out of range of the earlier party of Dracomancer's magic. Knowing that they had been divided into parties of 3 for this event, Vorf was slightly surprised to see only 2 of his peers struggling below, until he noticed the mashed body mass between them. There was another corpse, also unrecognizable, which Vorf assumed meant another party had been here with 2 successes. That boded well. His hand reached back and gripped the folded spear he had gathered solely for this journey. He was glad Nefkin had brought a surprisingly well-made bow and arrows, for he had to endure enough mockery for his insistence on carrying the spear. A mancer using weapons was bad enough, but a personally crafted weapon and not something he got off a magicless hunter? The whispers were quite the nuisance. Vorf could explain his theories on how mancers ran low on magic more quickly than they were willing to admit, and how more magicless tools converted into tools of war could be beneficial, but it always fell on deaf ears. Too similar to something a Secton might do. Anyway, while the 2 Dracomancers in front of him tried to extend their claws into swords whenever the dragon swooped in low enough, and tried to extend the length of their dragon flames whenever it was high, Vorf concentrated his magic into growing wings. It was a difficult spell, one few untested could master, and he could only maintain it for the shortest of times, but it would have to do. As Nefkin stared jealously at Vorf's extending new appendages, Vorf stared at his target. Monstrously large, larger than any animal had a right to be, yellow-gray scales, a bladed tail, claws that could slice a fully grown bear apart, muscle-bound legs, a mouth that could easily fit his entire body in it. Vorf flew straight toward it. The dragon was focused on the 2 earlier Dracomancers, and took no notice of Vorf. That was its first mistake. Its second was not using its tail when Vorf managed to uproot a scale with a spear, instead swinging its head and subsequently the thing's entire body around to take a bite of the upstart mammal. Its third was following Vorf as he flew back toward Nefkin, the latter's bow at the ready as the former's wings failed, plopping him down immediately next to his longtime companion in a somewhat embarrassing tumble, where it opened its mouth and prepared the blue fire that could burn stone and metal and turn Dracomancer boys into men. The 2 might have been tested right then and there had the others not taken advantage of the beast's slow fight to send forth bursts of their own dragon flame. It barely stung the dragon. They were untested and much too weak to do any serious damage. It wasn't too weak to get the creature's attention, however. Vorf almost cursed blasphemously when the mountain dragon turned away from them and unleashed its pent-up flame on the 2 below. Said dragon hadn't forgotten about them, however, as its tail swung down and sliced one dumbstruck Nefkin's face in half. Vorf stared in horror as his friend collapsed to the ground, so busy in this horror that he didn't even notice the bits of blood and tooth that had been sprayed on him. The force of the tail had Nefkin on his back, staring at the massive gash running down his face, demolishing his nose and leaving him with 2 tongues and 4 lips. Vorf couldn't tell whether the boy was dead or dying. He did know nothing could save him at this point. Nefkin died getting tested. He died becoming a true Dracomancer. As he told Zorlist, this was better than the alternatives. Probably partially motivated by shock, that was enough to convince Vorf to grieve later and deal with his ritual now. A newly tested Dracomancer was running for his life, a sight that almost sickened Vorf when he compared it to the untested. But the sick satisfaction he gained from realizing one hadn't been ready and had been incinerated by the undeserved dragon flame buried the feeling. Without thinking, without fully understanding, without planning, Vorf walked up to the dragon and tried to do something no untested had ever done before. Few tested had. A past High Chief had been named solely for his ability to do it multiple times in a row. Vorf tried to enslave the dragon. Most would have called him crazy. Make a mountain dragon scared? Calm it down? Those could be done by a few of the tested, and even some of the more skilled untested. Making it follow commands? Did he think it was a forest dragon? The mountain dragon stared at the young mancer who stood before him, a clawed hand raised in some strange and seemingly useless gesture, and did exactly what said mancer wanted. It breathed on him with dragon flame. Vorf wasn't certain that he had pulled off anything. That was a completely reasonable thing for a mountain dragon to do naturally. He did know that he felt something unfamiliar before the dragon unleashed its breath. What was it? He didn't know, as all he felt soon after was all-encompassing pain. For a brief moment, Vorf was afraid that he had mistaken his readiness, and the fire would consume him, but when the flames subsided, he was not only still standing, but invigorated. Fresh. New. He was tested, and it was wonderful. Maybe Vorf would mourn Nefkin later, but tonight he would celebrate. Tonight he would find joy in his newfound magical prowess. Assuming he could get away from the dragon, of course.